was about for the last 10 millennia, they brought that over to America when they started that mess. Except that they honed it, they streamlined it, they whittled it down to its core base components. America is the concentrated version. And with every single year, every passing year, they get more and more down to the bone about it. They get more and more down to the bone. They whittle it more down. I'm telling you that they're going more and more back to the original version, the 10,000 years ago version. And you know that occult tradition I was talking about with the jinn worship in Europe, that didn't die out with so-called modernity and the Industrial Revolution and whatever, the Satanism, the jinn worship and what have you. No, it went covert. It went covert, and then it re-emerged in like the 18th century and 19th century. Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, the Hermetic Order, Aleister Crowley, Theosophy, I've talked about that before. This is all European. All emerging from what their scholars call the Western esoteric tradition, which is nothing but a continuous thread running from pre-Christian paganism through the Renaissance to the occult revival into the modern secret societies that were behind, or that shaped anyway, the founding of America itself. I mean, you know that the founding fathers were not what you would call Orthodox or normal Christians. Many of them were so-called deists. A significant number of them were Freemasons. Washington was, Franklin was, Hamilton was, and so forth. Okay, so that's your founding spiritual heritage. Again, these are just historical facts. This is just for the record and from the record. This is the background. This is the genealogy of your society. You know, what I talked about before, when someone online is wearing filters, or someone has had extensive cosmetic surgery done to try to make themselves look more beautiful than they really are, than they are naturally. Well, there are two underlying elements to that, or maybe three, motives, I mean, not elements, motives. One is a sense of inadequacy, and the other is envy. And the third motive is that old predatory motive, you know, the filter as camouflage, as a hunting strategy. Look like what you're not, because if you look like what you are, you won't be able to get close to your prey. So you have to change your appearance and make yourself prettier. So the envy is real, the civilizational envy is real, and the sense of inadequacy is real. The European Renaissance, so-called, they'll tell you that that was the great sort of spontaneous flowering of great Western genius. But no, the Renaissance was a copy and paste project. That was copy and paste. Arabic texts were translated into Latin in Toledo and in Sicily. The Islamic world had preserved and had corrected and had improved Greek philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, while the Europeans were in what they called their Dark Ages, while they were still in their Dark Ages. They called it the Dark Ages because Europe was dark. The rest of the world wasn't dark. Baghdad wasn't dark. They had the House of Wisdom that was producing brilliant scholars, one after another. Cordoba was the most literate city in all of Europe because of us. We made it that, with libraries that dwarfed anything available in the rest of the continent, in Europe or in France, in UK, what have you. While they were still defecating where they stood, their aristocrats were defecating where they stood. Their peasants were dying of disease and being told by their priests that the earth was the center of the universe. We gave you algebra. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine was the standard medical textbook in European universities all the way up until the 17th century. The numerals that you use, the Arabic numerals, they're Arabic numerals, and that came to you through the Islamic world from India. The concept of zero, without which your entire computational civilization is impossible, that came by that same route. The navigational tools that enabled European exploration, the astrolabe, and so forth, improvements to the compass and so on, all of that came from us. All of that came from the Muslim world, from the Islamic world, and you took it. Paper came from China, also through the Islamic world to Europe. And then you used that paper to write your claims of civilizational superiority. And then after having absorbed all of this information that we provided to you, after you translated it, after you adapted it, and in most cases you did not credit the source of it, Europe then got to proclaim itself as the summit, the pinnacle of human achievement. The Athens miracle, the Greek miracle, Western tradition, which later became great white tradition, all rising up from the brilliant philosophers of Athens. The irony is that when you came up with the concept of whiteness, Greeks themselves weren't even included as white. You know, you talk about Rome, but you didn't even consider Italians as white either. Yes, you didn't even think of the people who you now hail as the originators of white Western civilization, the Athenians and the Romans. You didn't even consider those people as white. See, this is another layer of the unreality in your frameworks. The precise origin of the racial concept is documented. We know Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1676, black and white indentured servants, both of them indentured servants, enslaved Africans and poor European workers, united in an armed uprising against the planter class. They burned down Jamestown. They terrified the colonial elite because what they demonstrated was that class was more real to these people than the color line. Poor Europeans and enslaved Africans had more in common with each other than they had in common with the people at the top, than they had with the plantation owners. So the elite manufactured a solution. They created race. And within 30 years of the Bacon's Revolution or Rebellion, Virginia had passed the slave codes of 1705, legally defining who was white and what whites were entitled to and what Africans could be subjected to. For the first time in legal history, white appeared as a formal category with attached privileges. In exchange for those privileges, they were conscripted into the enforcement of the racial order. That's what whiteness is. That's what whiteness is at its origin. It's not a biological fact, obviously. It's not even a cultural heritage. It's a loyalty badge. It's an agreement between the planter class and the poor European workers. We will give you a psychological wage. We'll give you a status, a rung above someone else on the ladder. And in exchange for that, you agree to defend the system that is also exploiting you. Because at least you're not at the bottom. So be thankful for that. David Roediger called this the wages of whiteness. W.E.B. Du Bois identified it even before him. Read Theodore Allen. He documented it extensively. Theodore Allen. The mechanism is not disputed. This is a historical reality. And from that point on, whiteness was elastic. The definition of who counted as white would shift based on the needs of the economy and the needs of the political moment. The Irish, my ancestors, they came to America in the millions, fleeing from the Great Famine, which wasn't a famine at all. It was an imposed starvation because occupied white Ireland, occupied by the white English, they were forced to export their food to white England because the British needed their grain more than the Irish apparently needed to live. 1 million Irish people died. Another million of them emigrated. And when they arrived in America, they were not considered white. You see political cartoons from Harper's Weekly that depicted them with ape-like features alongside similar caricatures of black Americans. They were called white Negroes. Frederick Douglass, when he met the Irish in Ireland, he saw for himself what the British colonialism had done to them, and he said it wasn't very much different from what had been done to his people. He couldn't help but note the irony of the Irish immigrants arriving in America and immediately taking the side of the slaveholders so that they could claim the privilege of whiteness that they had been denied at home. The Irish became white in America by doing what whiteness required, distancing themselves from black Americans, so-called black Americans, filling the police forces, and enforcing the racial order. See, they paid the admission price. And this, by the way, no matter how many St. Patty's Day parades you hold over there in America, no matter how much green beer you drink, no matter how many shamrocks you plaster on your jacket, this behavior of the Irish immigrants coming to America has alienated the Irish in Ireland from Irish Americans forever because they adopted the oppressor's lens. They absorbed the oppressor's culture. And like I say, even the Italians were not white. In the American South, listen to this. In the American South in the late 19th century, Italians, particularly from the southern part of Italy, they were classified somewhere between white and black. They lived in black neighborhoods. They were basically segregated in terms of where they lived. They worked alongside black workers. They were sometimes subject to the same Jim Crow restrictions. And in 1891, in New Orleans, 11 Italian immigrants were dragged from a prison by a mob, and they were all lynched. And this is actually the largest mass lynching in American history, Italians. The men had already been acquitted in court, but it didn't matter. They were acquitted, but it didn't matter. The mob came for them anyway, and that mob was led by some of the most prominent citizens in New Orleans, citizens who later became mayors, who later became governors and renowned politicians. I bet you didn't know that that's the origin of Columbus Day, the lynching of Italian Americans, yes. Because it caused an international incident, and the United States government had to pay a small reparation to their families, and as a symbolic concession to Italian Americans, they created Columbus Day as a federal celebration in 1892. Imagine. And that's how Italians became white in America. It's an incoherent concept on every level, I'm telling you. The Polish, the Slavs, the Eastern Europeans, and so forth, they were categorized in the early 20th century by American eugenicists as racially inferior to Northwestern Europeans. You see, I told you they've always detested each other. They can't stand each other. There's a book by Madison Grant called The Passing of the Great Race, and they explicitly ranked Eastern Europeans as below the Anglo-Saxons and the Nordics. You know, Trump is going on and on about immigration and so forth, talking about bad hombres, and they're not sending us their best people and so forth, as if the best of any country would ever set foot in America. But there was an immigration act called the Immigration Restriction Act in 1924, and that was specifically designed to limit Eastern European immigration because they saw Eastern European people as racially undesirable in their country. That's what their so-called scientists told them. Don't even talk about the Jews. The Jews, obviously, they were classed completely separately from all other types of people. Those same eugenicists who ranked the Slavs also ranked the Jews, and they said that they were a distinct and threatening racial category. Madison Grant, Lothrop started the whole American academic mainstream of eugenics. Understand, these were not fringe figures. These were Harvard professors. They were cited by legislators. Think about that when you glorify those Ivy League schools. And when you think about your senators, or you think that your senators or your congresspeople actually stand for some kind of moral values. Now, these Neanderthal bigots were among your most celebrated intellectuals, and they were nothing but Neanderthal bigots. Their work was translated into German, and it was praised by Adolf Hitler. He said that he had a debt. He owed a debt to American race science. He said that in Mein Kampf. Speaking of Germans, the Germans are the single largest ancestry group living in America today. Roughly 1 in every 7 Americans has German heritage. I also have German heritage on my mother's side. If you go back far enough, even the Germans themselves were categorized as barbarians. Now, they were pretty much always classified as white. Ever since white became a category, they were pretty much always considered white. But in America, they were subjected to intense suspicion and cultural erasure during both World Wars, World War I and World War II. There were even German Americans who were put into internment camps, like the Japanese were. Okay? Now, the English, that's the original template. That's the original WASP template, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. That's the foundational American identity. I think everyone knows that. That's the official, original version of American whiteness, right? The Puritans of New England, the plantation aristocracy of Virginia, the Scot-Irish that settled in Appalachia and so forth. Those are the ones who later became known as the rednecks or the hillbillies or what have you. These are the building blocks. These are the building blocks of the founding cultural DNA of that country. I'm telling you, forget about white and actually learn about those people's history back where they came from. The Anglo-Saxons, the English, the French, the Germans, right? These are the main groups. These are your main groups in America. The origins of the American psyche. So when you know what they were like back in their lands of origin, if you know what they were like, then it's no wonder that the founding culture of America was built on stolen land, was built on enslaved labor. It was built on a set of decorative ideological documents declaring all men created equal while viewing only their own kindred as men, their only skin tone as men. Understand, this isn't hypocrisy, not in the ordinary sense. No, they're being completely consistent. They're being completely consistent with their ancestral culture and their ancestral thinking. Dehumanization is an unspoken but fully understood and fully accepted component of their framing of equality. See, they'll say all people are equal.